Hey, Faith Church, this is Pastor Matt, and I'm joined today by my friend, the Reverend Dr. Melissa Jackson. Melissa and I have been friends for a long, long time, 20 years. We both were working with youth at churches in Belmont on the other side of Charlotte. And when we got to know one another and be good friends and colleagues, and with some other churches there, we had a pretty cool ecumenical large youth group that were working together with Baptists and Catholics and Presbyterians and Foursquare Gospel and whoever else was around. That was an awesome time in my first job in ministry, and I credit Melissa with a lot of who I've become, shaped and formed as a minister. So I'm glad that she's able to join us today. Melissa's a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, for all you Tar Heels out there. Also, the Baptist Theological Seminary of Richmond. And Oxford University. She's a PhD in Old Testament. So I would have used any excuse to talk to Melissa, but she's an expert in Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, as the academics might prefer to call it, and thought she could talk to us this Sunday as we wrap up our series on these early stories of Genesis. One of the things we've said throughout the series is that these stories, telling events that were ancient at the time, but probably took their final written form during what's known as the Babylonian exile. Real trying, real difficult time for God's people, and that the stories they told and the ways that certainly they got put into print were shaped and formed by that experience. So I wonder, Melissa, if you'd talk to us a little bit about how that was kind of a forge that shaped and formed God's people, and yeah, how the trying times affect the stories we tell.
Sure. Thanks. And it's good to be with you virtually as it is, but and thank you for that introduction. And I have to say, any formation that I had influence on in your experience was returned at least as much, if not more. Yeah, in the story arc, if we want to call it that, of the Israelite people, it's a long arc from Genesis through the life of the people. So when we read the Old Testament, it's that story narrative that's preserved. But there's also a different time period in which that story was actually written down. And so when I talk about the Exiles' influence on the Old Testament, I always try to put it in terms of three different time periods: the past, the present, and the future. That if we think about, the story begins in Genesis as it's recorded and carries on, but it was this time period of the exile when that story was written down. If you think about it in terms of culture and how we behave as cultures, that when who we are as a people comes under threat, then we begin to think about writing down stories about who we are. And particularly for Israel, what they were facing in the exile was separation from each other and separation from their home. So, the impetus to write down the story of who they were becomes kind of an emergency because they know they're experiencing this dispersal. So in the exile, then they begin to harness their oral tradition in a written form. And in that written form, then what they're doing is they're looking back on the story of who they are. So they're looking into their past in this present moment as a way to both understand how they got to where they are, and then therefore as a way to understand how to move forward into their future. And not just their own future, but the future generations who would come after them. So it becomes a teaching tool as well. That they're looking back into their past, writing down the stories of who they were, but with an understanding that they have done something to get themselves to where they are. And so they want to to understand that past so it can inform the future, inform their future and all futures beyond them. Which then,
don't make the mistakes we made.
yes,
You
which
know,
then draws us into that same story. Yes. So learn from what we did to understand what you should do. And so it's a teaching story. In the same way that we read to our children, we read them stories, and the stories have a meaning, but those stories frequently also have a bigger meaning that we're trying to teach children about who we are as a community, and about how we live our lives together. And that's what corporate or cultural social identity is understanding yourself as part of something bigger than your individual self. And for the Israelites, that was both their relationship to each other and also their relationship to God and what that relationship looked like. So the Hebrew Bible is not then trying to be a history book or a math book or a cookbook or whatever. It's a book about the relationship between God and the people, and between amongst the people, within themselves and their relationship to other nations.
You said something, we were talking a little before we started rolling the camera about prescriptive versus descriptive. I thought
Yep.
was really helpful, making that distinction.
Yeah. So I think, I use the example of reading stories to children as a way to kind of teach them about themselves and about us as a community. And you might think about in your own families, like you might have a thing like, well, in the Smith family, we just don't do that. Right. That's a way to teach identity to the next generation. Like, let's talk about who we are and what we value. Right. So, but then somehow we seem to shed that often as adults, that we begin to center our understanding of the world around us in terms of like data and facts. And we call that truth. But the distinction I would make is maybe between what I would say like small t, little t truth and capital T truth. That when we understand story as a way to teach us, what we're saying is that there's a bigger truth here, something that is capital T true, that transcends data or facts or the way that we experience the world around us that way. That there's something that is true with a capital T that doesn't have to do with historical facts or something. And so in that sense, the Hebrew Bible becomes something that is, and this is a term I say a lot, descriptive rather than prescriptive. That as a story, what it does is it reflects us back to ourselves. It describes who God's people were, who they were in their relationships to each other and to God. And in doing that, it shows us something true, capital T, about who we are. And then therefore how we should be in relationship with each other. And that's not something you can quantify with an equation or a to-do list or something. It's bigger than. And so when we read the text and we encounter, difficult texts, one of the first questions we can ask is, what is it in this text that is causing me pain, causing us corporately, communally pain to read? And recognize that those things that were causing them pain, oppression, the marginalization and oppression of people who are vulnerable in society, and the lack of access to things, those things that were causing them pain and difficulty are the same kinds of things that continue to cause us pain and difficulty.
Yeah.
And so we can see something of ourselves in the text that describes us. So it's not saying you should go out and emulate everything that you read in the Bible. That's not why it's there. That this whole process of the people being in chaos and disruption and separation in the exile showed them the importance of who they were and needing to write that down in order to teach it for people to come. So it's not saying that every single thing that happened is how you should order your life. It's saying that this story teaches us who we are. It shows us who we are. And in so doing, it teaches us who we need to strive to be.
And there's some tensions, like we talked about at Faith on February 6th, that here we have the story of Babel, the
Yeah.
Tower of Babel being laid low, and kind of wondering, are our differences destined to be a curse forever?
Right.
Right. But then there's a couple other stories nearby in Genesis. One, one not really a story, but the Table of Nations, which sort of talks about how all God's people descended from Noah's children, and therefore we're part of the same family. That God's the God of all of them. There's not some other God out there, uh, right? And they've all been beneficiaries of God's mercy by being descendants of Noah, right? And so God, maybe wants us to extend mercy to one another. And then you have the story of Abraham.
Yeah.
He's blessed. We talked about this on the 13th. He's blessed all in order to be a blessing. And when people bless him, they're going to be blessing God. And, so there's just these differing perspectives on diversity. You could see why people in the exile would have wondered, are our differences a curse? Because, gosh, they experienced that rough stuff. But then there are also a possibility for mercy to be shown and blessings to be shared.
Absolutely. And I think this is where this whole notion of the Bible being descriptive rather than prescriptive is helpful, because if you think about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, even as like stories within a story, that not every single story is going to have the same perspective as every single other story. So you are getting different perspectives. And, if we're talking about like our contemporary situation, we might just say that like we might apply, like in your family, you might have a rule that you have and you'll apply it one way in this situation, but then you have a similar situation, you're going to apply that rule differently because the day of the week is different, or the child that you're dealing with is different, or whatever the condition might be. So that you do have these tensions, that one story seems to be saying something and another story might seem to be saying something different, maybe slightly different, maybe a lot different. And there's a lot to unpack there, and it requires us as readers and students of the Bible and the story to kind of dig in a little bit. Like, it's not easy. And if we expect reading the Bible to be easy, we're going to get thwarted really quickly. And because we do have this. But the other thing about this whole notion of descriptive is you can say, okay, we read the story of the Tower of Babel, and do we say, because those people did what they did, now they all can't talk to each other, and so sorry, that's just how it is, and accept that as a difference that we can't surmount in some meaningful way? Or do we say, like, we know that God wants us to be in relationship with each other? That's an overarching piece of the story. So how do we go back to the story of Babel and understand that our reality is that, let's just say on a surface level, we speak different languages, but we don't just accept that. We learn each other's languages. We write books, like you talked about the dictionary. We write dictionaries and other kind of books to try and bridge those gaps between us. So there is an invitation. I'm not sure that's the word you used, Matt, but there is an invitation here to an interpretation. Do we have to accept that the things that want to pull us apart have to still be divisive? Or can we say, we know that God is a loving God and God wants us to be in relationship. So how do we go and build the bridge? How do we rebuild the Tower of Babel in a way that isn't hubris? It isn't us trying to reach out to God, but is some way in us trying to reach out better to one another.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the kind of interpretation that we can do with integrity, that we're trying to bridge both a story, a text that's fixed, like the words on the page of the Bible are not going to change. But the people who read the Bible are changing all the time, not to mention the fact that people from all over the world are reading that same Bible. I mean, it's why we do World Communion Sunday, right? That we can, in that moment, celebrate that all over the globe, we're doing it together, even though we're not physically present with one another. That we have this fixed text, but we all exist in our own context in time and place. And so we're invited and given opportunities out of our own situation to go back to this text and understand it in ways that we can live out in this context. And that's that whole, too, that present, looking to the past, moving into the future kind of time period, that if you can see if you can read the Bible and hold all those, I know it's not easy, but kind of hold those time periods in your mind, then it does help us learn how to be, having kind of had the Bible be a mirror of who we are, without saying you should do this. You should go out and build a tower as high as you can, see if you can get to God.
Right. One of the things we said in the series is, sometimes people get so laser focused on what really happened at that earliest context that they never asked the question what was happening at the time when it was written down. They never asked the question of what's the application now. I don't want us to get so bogged down in the arguments that some people seem to have is, did this happen exactly as written? Is that the same way National Geographic would have reported from the scene? And other people who say, oh, it's impossible, that's all useless, it's all legend, it's all fiction, there's no value to even looking at such an absurd story. And that's kind of, sometimes as Christians we get in an argument with those people, and it's just not very fruitful. It's not very helpful about how to live life and the big T truth that the Bible wants to convey about God and people and the world that we're in.
And I think, but you've identified kind of ends of a spectrum. It's not quite that black and white, but like on the one hand, it seems to say the only thing that matters is the original context, as if where we are, who we are, doesn't matter. And the other seems to say that there's no value in it because we can't trace it as being true in some way. Like that, because it's a myth, it has no value, which we've already said, we use story and identity to understand who we are all the time. So both of those ends kind of miss this capital T true understanding in different ways. Which, when we ask the Bible to be a history book, we are asking the Bible to do something that the Bible itself has not set out to do. Right? So if you open up a chemistry book expecting there to be a recipe on how to make biscuits, you're not going to get it. Now, you will get some understanding about how baking soda and baking powder and salt interact with the chemical reactions that happen that make a biscuit possible. But if you ask a science book to be a cookbook, you're not reading it in a way that's consistent with its own understanding of itself. And the Bible always intended to be a book about the people's relationship with God. And that's not true just in the Old Testament. That's true of the entire Bible. It's not trying to be a science book. It's also not trying to just be a storybook. It is, right. It is the most important narrative for the people because it is the narrative that shapes them, shapes who they are down to the very core of their being. So in that sense, it's monumentally important. It's not just a story, but it is a story that is, teaching them. I'm not sure if that responds to what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does. As you look at these stories, are there things that leap out at you as somebody who understands biblical Hebrew? I took a couple semesters of it in seminary and was pretty awful. But as someone who can look at this story in the Hebrew, what are some things we might miss that might be? I mean, I know one of your concentrations there at Oxford was in humor.
Mm-hmm.
What's funny about these stories to you, and what purpose does that humor serve?
Yeah. So my focus in my doctoral research, and then I've done some work since then, was focused around this idea of comedy in the Hebrew Bible. And so I don't want to give people the impression that you're going to read the Bible and fall over in the floor laughing. That's one definition of what you might think of as comedy, something that's funny, that makes you laugh and have that visceral response to it. if you kind of pull back from that direct experience of comedy and think about it a little more like comedy as a form. So we say, like, we have comedy and we have tragedy, and those are literary forms. So we've talked about the Bible as in part being a story. So if you think about stories have forms, that a typical picture description would be like a comic form is a U shape. So you start at a high point and then something happens and you just sort of reach this low point. But then in comedy, something comes along to push that back up. And so the ending, and it's not necessarily a happy ending, but there's an ending where you have a sense of hopefulness, renewed life, regeneration that you didn't have down here. So comedy is the inverse. Tragedy is the inverse of that. That you start low, and then you might get raised up for a bit, but you're going to, right? This is where you're going to end. So one of the things when I talk about and understand what it means to see comedy as an aspect of the Hebrew Bible, it's this, and also for the New Testament, it's more, as for Christians, it's more significant when we think about it in terms of the New Testament. But this idea that no matter where we may find ourselves here, there's a hopefulness that never leaves us here. That means we will find a way to move into this place of renewed life, hopefulness, and that we're never going to just be here, that there's always going to be this
it's Good Friday, but Sunday's coming kind of move.
Exactly. So the Easter story encapsulates that really well. But even just this whole idea of salvation as a renewal of life, that's always where the story is moving for Christians, especially. So understanding us as people kind of in a comic form, also then means this is how we live life. Like, we live life with this comic vision. So there's a prominent writer on the topic who talks about the comic vision of the Christian life, that we are always moving into this forward but upward, hopeful, faith-filled, faith-based understanding of our story arc, if you will. The other thing about comedy, so if I was to say to you, can you define comedy or define what's funny, we would all kind of fall down. It's impossible. Like, even people who are professionally dedicated to it fall down on this front. But one of the things that's consistent is comedy as experiencing incongruity. So that's kind of a fancy way of saying you think it's going to be one way and that's not what you get. Yeah. So a really early example of what's considered comic is there's an identified painting on a cave wall that shows different animals playing what appears to be a board game like chess or something. And this definition of comedy, and it does give you a chuckle, doesn't it? Just the idea of thinking of, in a giraffe and an elephant and a rhino in the zoo pull out their chessboard and start playing. Like
dogs playing poker. That's high art right there. Yeah.
And to be honest, then, dogs playing poker draws its art from this origin of people from the very beginning recognizing that things happen around us that we think it's going to be this way and it's not that way.
In the stories we've looked at in January and February, you got Noah and his family saved through the ark, and the dove comes and the water recedes and they're on dry land, and he holds this worship service to end all worship services. Right. And then the very next story, he, plants himself a vineyard, gets rip-roaring drunk, and one of his kids humiliates him. And it's sort of, and so, is God going to relate to everybody equally through this one family? Well, I guess not, but God's going to try this other tack with Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah. And so we get this promise, like, Noah still is a child of the promise, no matter what Noah does, which is part of this kind of, even if you think of it, so it's not even, if we're depicting it, like, it's not even like one you, it's like in life, what we're doing is we're doing this all the time, so even as we reach these high points, it's inevitable that we're going to stumble again pretty short order, probably, as Noah teaches us in his mode as reflecting us back to ourselves, right? That
Right.
even as we exist in these moments of great hope,
Descriptive, not prescriptive, folks.
yeah.
You
Is that what yeah. It's that in
don't have
these
to get drunk right after worship. Not
yeah,
necessary.
even in these moments filled with great hope that we're gonna get knocked, and we're gonna be the agents of our own getting knocked as well. We're gonna be the ones that step off that and begin to send ourselves into another kind of this place. But that this is, God is always trying to move and intervene in our lives to bring us back up to this point where we're living in hopefulness and joy. And so despite Noah's, great like exaltation, if you will, and being chosen in this story to survive this tragedy, and then to stumble, but then also to receive a promise. And God says, okay, this isn't going to happen again. And there is a promise to carry on. And then, yes, exactly, we get Abraham. And then Abraham starts a long line of flawed people who carry the promise. And so the promise lives even in the midst of the people's stumblings, flawed. And from my perspective, like when I'm writing on comedy in particular, it's in these stories with Abraham and forward, how they just keep messing up. And there's comedy in that, again, in the way that it's true. It tells us something about ourselves. We're
Right.
these people.
That's why we laugh at a stand-up comic quite frequently. They're just reflecting life back to us,
Absolutely.
and if what they're saying captures your experience, you probably think they're pretty funny, and if it doesn't, you don't.
And I will say one thing, like two things that are accurate about comedy is, one, it's serious, and two, it's true. And those are two things that we might not necessarily first think of when we talk about comedy. But comedy fails if it's not true, if it doesn't tell us something about our lives that's true, and if it doesn't say, it's just a mode of giving us a serious message. That comedy fails if its underlying message to us is not real and grounded in reality and serious in that way.
Yeah.
So like one example I would give, because you're talking about the Hebrew, and this isn't necessarily something in the Hebrew, you can read it, but there's this kind of, if you can imagine it playing out on a stage, this scene where after the man and the woman have eaten from the tree when they were told not to,
Uh-huh.
and then God comes along looking for them, right? So even all this begins to, you can see it in a comic light, God, where are you? As if God doesn't know where they are, right?
Right.
And then they have this thing where God's like, what have you been up to? And the man goes, she did it. And the woman goes, it did it. This kind of Three Stooges thing of, the man's getting called out by God, and God's like, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. It was her. And then the woman's like, no, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. It was it.
Yeah.
And again, it's funny if you imagine it, but it's also true. And it's also serious. I mean, this is a moment of this is a big moment in the relationship between God and the people. And what comes out of this moment is a big deal, because then, they're separated from the garden, and these, consequences, we sometimes call them curses, come out of this. So it's a huge moment for in the narrative, in the story, but it's told in kind of a funny way that reflects us back. It also, another thing about comedy is that it's subversive. So we talk about sometimes in comedy about punching up versus punching down, that punching up is comedy and punching down is abuse.
So like the story of Esther,
Yeah.
they're delivered from evil Haman, and
Yes.
but then the end of the story is, then the Jews got to turn around, and instead of being like enslaved and persecuted and
Yeah.
shot and stabbed by their neighbors,
Yeah.
they could turn around and do it to them.
Yes. And there's a lot to be said about Esther and the comedy there, and how it works, and how it kind of it allows a storytelling of the violence. So it's it's not a huge component yet in the biblical story. We get to Cain and Abel, and then we encounter real violence for the first time. But how comedy harnesses violence in a way that it expresses our desire without instructing us to enact it. So it's a catharsis in that sense, that we can comically act out violence, and that prohibits us from acting it out in real life. So this is a prime example of descriptive, not prescriptive. That a story like Esther says, you know what, it's natural for you to be very, very angry at the people who step on you.
Yeah.
That is not the same thing as to say that you should go out with your weapons and mow them down.
Right. Right.
And yeah, so so there is often then this aspect of harnessing violence in comedy, but also this notion of subverting the order. And one of the so punching up is comedy, whereas if you punching down, so some of the kind of bigoted artwork that came out during World War II in the US around Japanese who were interned, like, so that's not funny, that's abuse, that's punching down.
Right.
But what happens frequently in the Hebrew Bible is this punching up from the perspective of the women in the story. So one of the ways where I see the comedy of this,
Shut out of like the normal avenues of power and authority and all this sort of stuff.
yeah,
But it's not that they have no initiative, that they
exactly.
have no like unofficial power.
So there's this kind of dual thing happening in this exchange. One is that, the woman is approached by the serpent, the snake. And some people read that as it's because she was weaker, but you could also read that as because she was stronger, because then she is going to be put in this role of kind of bringing her male partner along in it. But the other thing that it points to in the story is that people want to make the woman responsible for what happened there, except what we know from that interaction is that he's right there with her. Right. And so this is part of the kind of a subvertive aspect of that humor, that you might want to make her responsible for all of it. And then, the whole history of interpretation since then somehow holds her more responsible for what happened. It's like, how is that possible? Because we know from that interaction that he was right there with her.
Right. Right.
So that's, I think what I would encourage people to do is go back and read that interaction and kind of stage it in your mind, and you begin to see how humorous it is, because this is how we are. You watch little kids lined up. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. It wasn't me.
Right.
Which goes on infinitely until there's nobody else to blame except the puppy, right?
Yeah. And just, so much of ourselves to recognize in all these stories. It's really awesome. I wonder, we kind of covered this already in some ways, but stories that are troubling to us, like, I talked about the nursery in the first church where I was appointed as a minister after being commissioned in the United Methodist Church, and we had a nursery with 11 depictions of Noah's Ark in it. And I was like, oh, this is a story about when God wiped out humanity with a flood. And that it's just kind of, what do we do with stories that are tough for us as modern hearers? How do we make sense of them? How is that God's word for us today?
Right. Yeah, because with the Noah story, what we tend to do is we focus on the preservation aspect of the story, and we don't focus and we don't wrestle with the destruction aspect of the story. So we have identified this beautiful picture of all these animals going onto the ark as something that is for children, and then we stop. Right? I mean, you don't, like, there wasn't a 12th picture in that nursery showing all the animals that weren't on the ark drowning, as well as the humans and the trees and creation being destroyed in the flood, right? And it does, again, this is another way in which the Bible reflects us back to ourselves. Like we very quickly find our own discomfort. And unless we make a concerted effort, we will tend to stop because we don't want to be made uncomfortable, right? But what I always say, and I say it really strongly and really loudly and really annoyingly often, that those are the moments when you should dig in rather than step back. At your first feeling of discomfort, you should stop right there and not disengage, but engage more, because you've found the spot suddenly where you're being challenged. And then, so what's the next step? Like, what does it look like to re-engage? And I want to come back to what I said before, which is that we have a fixed text, a story, a narrative, a Bible, where the words and the letters on the page are not going to change.
Right.
And yet we have people who are reading it who are changing constantly. And so we become that bridge between the text and our context, the thing in our hand that is unchanging, and the lives that we live, the relationships that we have that are constantly changing. And take heart and get permission from the Bible itself that it's okay for us to interpret and reinterpret. This is what, going back to the very beginning, this idea of writing things down in the exile, to look at our past, to interpret it for the future. And this process keeps happening in this present. We're looking at our past to interpret it for the future. We're looking at our past, I'm running out of screen, but to interpret it for the future. This process is happening all the time. And so we are invited into that same process. It means that we don't have to stick in a context that is thousands of years old, that we live in our own context, and that's okay. The Bible doesn't say anything about the internet. And yet during the pandemic, congregations all over the globe have figured out what it means to use the internet to help us maintain community, right?
Right.
So we can,
including having a Zoom with my friend Melissa
absolutely,
that gets recorded. But yeah.
So I think the first thing with difficult texts is we can come back to this descriptive, not prescriptive, that those things were hurtful then, and for us, they are hurtful now. And so we can find 2022 ways, as in the year of 2022, ways to interpret these texts without trying to bring the context of 729 BCE as if we just overlay the old context onto the new.
Right.
And there are lots of questions about that we grapple with that come up, like how we treat gender identity, gender relationships, that there is a hierarchy in place in the Bible. Comedy helps us see places where it's subverted, where women do have power, even if they have to use it in ways that are suspect. Like when you if you get to Genesis 38, which is a story of Judah and Tamar, that the man is entrusted with carrying forward the values of society, and he falls down on that, and Tamar uses some suspect means to reassert the just order of things. And so even though she's been kind of behaviorally suspect, by the end of the story, she's the one that's being called righteous, whereas Judah, who's one of the father patriarchs of Israel, is the one who's being kind of pointed at and saying, you didn't do your job.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah. So I think it's hard. Like the first thing to say is there are things in the Bible, and in particular in the Hebrew Bible, that are difficult. And we have set those institutions and those ways of relating aside, right? We do not in any form affirm slavery, right? But
Right.
the context of the Hebrew Bible was a world in which there were enslaved people. So what do we do with that? I mean, we've rejected slavery, but we haven't rejected the Bible. So there is a pathway there to interpreting the Bible with integrity, while also recognizing that there are parts of that original context that just aren't relevant for us anymore. Or we have flat out said, this isn't who we are. Because we've moved forward, we've found a better way to be in relationship with each other.
Right.
So we're in a new present, looking at the past to a new future.
Yeah. Yeah. That's helpful. That's as we hopefully read our Bibles, and I've said in this series that it's more important than taking it literally, or whether you take it more literally or more figuratively. I want you to take it seriously, and have this as a conversation partner for you in your life, and use it to discern what God might be calling of you to be and do now.
To take
So
it
that all that
seriously.
context conversation is really helpful.
Yeah. And to take it seriously does, again, give you permission to challenge it, to question it, to put it to the test, and to be able to set aside things, little t true things, maybe in aid of a capital T true thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Last kind of question for this morning. As we try to be people who take this story seriously, why don't you tell them how you're taking sort of the the biblical story seriously in this cool endeavor in theological education
Yeah.
called Sophia Theological Seminary there.
Yeah, so been involved for going on 3 years now with a group starting and engaged in this endeavor. It's Sophia Theological Seminary and Sophia Farms. So we recognize Sophia as a name that we might give to a person, but also Sophia is derived, it's a Greek word that means wisdom. And so we chose Sophia for that reason. It is, in short, a small seminary that is financially sustained by a working produce farm. So the idea is that students of the seminary would put in work on the farm. The farm, then we sell the vegetables from the farm, and those proceeds fund the seminary's operating costs, so that then students do not pay tuition or housing, that those would be provided via the seminary's farms proceeds.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really cool idea. So it's an ancient idea. So if you think about monasteries have for a long, long, long time, and other religious institutions as well, been self-sustaining through some kind of product, beer, cheese, fruitcake. There used to be a monastery in Western Virginia who completely supported their community by a fruitcake. So there you
Oh,
go.
man. Must be better fruitcake than what I've had.
So it's an ancient idea to be self-supporting, self-sustaining financially, but we have not yet found a place where it's supporting a seminary. There are seminaries that have farms. There are plenty of universities that have farms, of course, that are learning labs, if you will. But in our case, it's Sophia Farms is a business endeavor. It's a nonprofit, but it is a business endeavor to support the seminary. And our primary means, so we have a couple of products that we've created, and one of them is our hot sauce, which we call Use Wisely Hot Sauce. So you can see we adopted the Sophia Wisdom Wise in the sauce. And then we're also running.
I've had some, folks. It's good.
It is, as I like to describe, it's fruit forward because it's fermented rather than cooked. But anyway, we also are running a CSA. CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. And that's a model whereby people buy a subscription to the crops ahead of the season. And then once the crops start rolling in, we divvy it up and give it in shares back to the people. So that's between the CSA and the products, that's the business side. And then that is going to feed in. So we have done the CSA for 1 year. We did it in 2021 without students. So we did it with volunteers and faculty. So the idea is that we will grow, and we're hoping to admit students either this year or next year. And all of this is in aid of a small self-sustainable seminary, because seminaries are financially in distress right now. It's just a reality of the age. And so this was a response to, again, trying to be faithful both in terms of financial stewardship, but more significantly to going back to this idea that humans, as the story tells it, come from the dirt, right?
Uh-huh.
And there is a pun in the naming. In Hebrew, the word for ground is Adamah, and of course, the eventual name of that first human is Adam. So there's a pun, not a hilarious pun, but a pun there to take, the Adam is from the Adamah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so this, at a most basic level, that we have the deepest connection to the land that you possibly could, that we are derived from the land. Also, that God's nearly first commandment then to those created beings was to take care of that land. And so our theology at Sophia is built around this kind of triangle of interdependence between God, creation, and the created. Or I guess we could say God, creation, and humanity. But that, creation draws its origin from God, but it's also dependent on humanity for its well-being. Humanity then is reciprocally dependent upon creation for its well-being, and also has been commanded by God to take care of this creation, and that God, in that sense, requires us and creation in order to do God's own work in the world. And so this complex triangular relationship forms us at our most basic existence. And so this is our own interpretive attempt to order our lives after that understanding of who we are in relationship to God, in relationship to each other, and in relationship to the creation around us. It's really exciting. It's a lot of work. But we're making strides, and we're located in Dinwiddie, Virginia, which is about 45 miles south of Richmond. That's where our farm is. And we have reworked a lot about seminary to make it integrate with life on a farm. So we are doing more seminars and less classes, if you will, so that students have flexibility to be in the field working and also dedicate themselves to their studies. It's a full-time residential program, so it's very much based not just theologically on the land, but physically we're all there together. The faculty won't live at the farm, the students will.
Well, that's such an awesome, bold, innovative experiment that seems to like be putting all these principles into place about what we've learned from Genesis. And I mean, I wish you the best with it. It's really exciting, and just the experience for the seminarian sounds so great. To not have student loan debt when you come out, is so liberating. That it's just amazing. So I
And
commend you for it.
we welcome groups. We're not that far from y'all. So if you want to have a field trip up one day to plant some vegetables, we would welcome you.
That's right. That's right. That would be awesome. But Melissa, thank you for your time this morning, for your great wisdom, and
Well, thank you
for
for the invitation. I appreciate it.
your encouragement to our people to keep reading these stories and to keep wrestling with them and to invite them to make sense of their lives in light of them. And it's really awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.